I guess it fixed it. All right, well, there we go. Hey, we're live. I didn't even know it. You're probably looking at a screen at me looking at my computer. My guest today is David Halbert. David, welcome to the Lincoln Review podcast. How you doing?
Doing well, Jeff. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, so the only people that are going to watch this and go, what's going on, are the people on Twitter. I'll clean up everything for YouTube and the audio afterwards. But thank you, man, for coming on. I appreciate it. To give the audience a little bit of a background on what I know about you is, first, we met 7 years ago.
Yeah.
7 years ago, I had just gotten done running for United States Congress, and the Urban League had invited me to do a panel on the upcoming election between Mitt Romney, Barack Obama, and you were the moderator of that panel.
I was.
And did a great job, and I
you.
remembered you, of course. So when I realized that you were running for city council, reached out to your campaign, and congratulations on making the final ballot, for one.
Thank you. It was a lot of work and still a lot of work to do to get to November 5th, but we're feeling good about it.
Excellent. Explain to me, for the audience at home that's not familiar with city council structure, you were running for at-large, correct?
At-large.
So why don't we just kind of get into the nuts and bolts real quick of what at-large means?
Sure. So the Boston City Council has 13 members. 4 of them are at-large, so citywide, covering all 22 wards, all 255 precincts across the city, and that's one of the positions that I'm running for. Then the other 9 positions are districts, and so they cover different geographic areas of the city. And it's been that way since the council changed structure in 1983. Formerly, prior to that, it was all at-large councilors. And one of the reasons that they changed that was to make sure that communities, particularly in the case of communities of color, were able to have more representation and voice at City Hall,
right.
Which is good. And so since then, we've seen some of that happen in that way, but it's taken some time. The council, and I say this as somebody who was a staff member on the city council a little over 10 years ago, and I can tell you now that I believe that the council is a much more dynamic body, and I think part of that is the fact that you have just more diversity of thought and opinion and experience. Not just in terms of racial and ethnic diversity, gender diversity as well, just different backgrounds and perspectives, and I think that's good for the city.
That is a very good stump speech and explanation. You are well rehearsed. You're in the middle of it. How do you like running for office so far?
It's an amazing experience. It's hard to believe that it's a little over 3 weeks until this is all said and done, one way or the other. But since I've been running, I was actively running since last fall, and then actually quit my job in June to run full time.
Okay.
And it was a big decision. I have 2 small children as well as a wonderful wife and a mortgage, so
right.
We had to have a lot of conversations about that. I know you've been there.
Yeah. Well, people don't understand that when you run for office. Like, I ran for office, and I still worked while I was doing it, and it is incredibly hard. I loved it too. I loved just about every aspect. I couldn't stand the paperwork, but other than the paperwork, it was like the filing deadlines, the financial disclosures, all that, the fundraising paperwork, all that stuff. It was just it was federal office. Maybe it's a little bit different for city council, but it was just a pain in the butt. But I loved it. I loved getting out there, meeting people, listening to what they had to say, talking about the issues that we're facing. It's a rewarding experience, and kudos to you. So how many people were originally on the ballot for the at-large seats that because you're one of the final 8?
Yes.
And of the final 8, people in Boston get to vote for 4.
Correct.
Okay.
Up to 4.
Up to 4, and remind everybody how many people you beat out. So how many people were originally running? Well, it's good. I mean, it's a win. A win is a win.
Well, so originally there were, I believe, 23 individuals who pulled papers to see if they could get their name on the ballot. And then we all had to get our signatures in. So 1,500 certified signatures to City Hall in about 3 weeks.
1,500?
1,500.
That's almost as much as U.S. Congress.
Yeah.
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a lot of hustle. And
yeah.
One of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that in Boston, signatures of good voters can actually be disqualified because there's a threshold in terms of the number of submissions they'll take. So, for example, in our race, because there were up to 4 seats, if you signed off through the nomination papers for 6 people, the first 4 to turn those into the city elections department to get certified get credit, and the next 2, they get X'd out. So you actually have to get significantly more than those 1,500 in order to make
or
that happen.
can you turn them in quickly and then get credit for it, or it doesn't work like that?
Once they hit that 4 limit, it doesn't matter
Oh, that
who else
sucks.
does it.
I'm
So
sorry. That's tough.
So believe me, there were a lot of very early mornings at City Hall,
Yeah.
making sure that we got them in,
Yeah.
and you got to see the same people every morning for about 3 weeks there. But it's a test of organization and strength, and
Nice.
so thankfully we were able to make that happen. And at the conclusion of that, once they were all certified, we were one of the 15 campaigns that were certified to be on the ballot. And then on September 24th, we had the preliminary election. As you said, I was one of the top 8 finishers, and so it was the top 8 of us. We'll go on to November 5th to the final election, and then ultimately the top 4 there will be the next set of city councilors starting in January for the next 2 years.
Awesome, man. Well, good luck.
Thank you.
All right, so let's get into it. I wanted to ask you 3. Well, the question to me, I mean, we have limited time, but we're going to be able to dive deep into a good amount of stuff here. In order of priority, what are the top 3 issues and facing the city of Boston, and what do you think we need to do to address those issues? So
Sure.
we'll take it one by one, or list all 3, and then we'll go one at a time.
Yeah. Well, I'd say the number one issue that I think anyone you will talk to who's a candidate in this race will tell you is housing. Absolutely. And, with the pace of housing, how it's being developed, how it's being put into the city, who's being able to access that housing as well. It's critical. It's a larger umbrella, and it doesn't matter what neighborhood you're in. So when I'm in West Roxbury or Roxbury, East Boston, South Boston, everywhere in between, it really doesn't matter. Everybody is concerned about housing and the impact that has on our city. And that's been one of my principal concerns, in looking at this. Boston is an incredible city. It's a dynamic city. But what I don't want to see happen is what's happened in other communities. You look at a place like San Francisco, which is a world-class city, international, cosmopolitan, but it also has some of the starkest income inequality issues and issues around incredibly wealthy people, but also a lot of homeless people, very little middle class, very few children, relative to a city of its size. And that's unfortunate, because that's not how you build a healthy and dynamic community that can be ongoing and be a place for everyone. And
Okay.
I don't want to see that happen in Boston. I want to see a city where people at all different price points, all different levels of socioeconomic strata are able to have a place.
I agree with that. I mean, Boston's my home. It's greatest city, in the world. It's my favorite. New York is turning into a hellhole. If you've recently visited there, and Boston is terrific. It really is. It is a fantastic place to live. But that's a blessing and a curse, right? Because it's a fantastic place to live. A lot of people want to live here. When they move here, prices go up. So, housing. What do you think we need to do to solve that? The housing, I'll call it crisis. I think we're prices are going through the roof, and it's a difficult situation. And I'll tell the audience up front here. I told David, we're gonna have a friendly. If I want to push back on some of the ideas or ask more, or how are you gonna pay for it, or all that stuff, so we'll keep it more of a conversation. But what do you think needs to be done to improve the housing situation in Boston?
Yeah, I think it's definitely, like many policy issues, it's multifaceted, right? There's no silver bullet. A lot of times, one of the things that comes up is a conversation around rent control. And I am on record in support of it, but I always tell people rent control isn't going to solve the problem alone. And
how deep do you want to get into rent control? So let me just change something. So what when we say rent control, and I have some info up on that I pulled up because I saw one of the debates earlier this week or last week where a lot of the city council candidates were in favor of rent control. Is there some nuance to your rent control thoughts, or are you just saying across the board, the city, it's frozen, only go a percentage of a year? Get into it. So I don't want to misinterpret any plan you might have.
No. So I would say this: when we're talking about rent control, as I said, I think it is one tool in a larger policy suite that can be applied. Think about it in this way: if you consider the housing crisis as an injury to the city, if you will, right? Rent control is in some ways kind of the bandage, but you still got to, you can use it to hopefully in the immediate sense help stop some of the bleeding so that you can ultimately get to a place, to a hospital in this case, where you're able to have the interventions that you need to have the actual healing happen, right? And those are deeper, more substantive policy initiatives.
So who's bleeding in that perspective?
So I think particularly you're seeing that in communities. It affects largely communities of color and lower on folks on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum. The number of people that I've talked to in a lot of different neighborhoods, and I'll ask them, see them on the street, see them at a barbershop, see them at an event, and ask them, oh, do you live here? Do you live around the area? Oh, no, I grew up here, but no, I couldn't afford anything. I got priced out. I got pushed out. I live in Brockton. I live, and so I live in New Bedford now. And it's unfortunate to see that because it can have a pretty destabilizing effect on communities, particularly communities where you've had multi-generational families that have lived there. But once again, it's not the only solution. And I think that a lot of times people get so caught up in talking about it that they miss the forest for the trees, that we are not talking about the other policy initiatives that we need to have. So one of those, sorry.
But would you implement rent control just in certain neighborhoods, or are we talking about citywide? So, I mean, tell me, like, nuts and bolts, you're on the city council. Yep. City council is proposing rent control. And we can get into the trade-offs in a second, but practically, I mean, the city has boundaries, lines around it. Does it affect the entire city? How do you, or have you not? Maybe it's too detailed to get into, and you don't have to get into it. But when I think rent control, they slap rent control. It's for the whole city, so all apartment buildings with rent is frozen, only allowed to go up by a certain percentage for a certain amount of time. I mean, if you get into, we're getting into some very dicey areas if you start to throw it on certain neighborhoods or certain people.
Yeah, no, you wouldn't have it on certain neighborhoods. But as I said, I think that it's that you see more impact on it, potential for neighborhood stabilization in certain neighborhoods from what we've discussed and what we've seen out on the campaign trail. But, it would be universal because I think when it's one of those things where it has to be all or none. It's similar to what people talk about the residency requirement for city employees. It has to be kind of all or none, or else it dilutes it. And as you said, it has disparate impacts on certain neighborhoods and certain communities. And then you're getting too fine-grained into it, and by over-emphasizing, prescribing it in particular areas versus other areas.
Okay, so citywide, and the thing about it is, I've read some pretty good studies about it that I can pull up in a second, but we don't have to. The Brookings Institute, which leans left, did a study on the Cambridge rent control that was in effect from I think 1969 to 2004, something like that, or maybe it was 94. I have it up there. I will not deny that rent control does have some positive impact for certain renters who aren't going anywhere, who want to be where they are, and their rent-controlled apartment exists essentially in perpetuity, right? They're gonna be there for a long time. Their cost of living will not rise. That's good for them. But what the study found, which I think why you saw rent control disappear in a lot of places across the country, except for like New York City, where it's just about impossible to get rid of, they did get rid of it in Cambridge. What you found was it drove property values down. And when property values went down, tax revenue went down. So it created this spiral where the schools then started to deteriorate. And it's again, all economic decisions that the government gets involved with result in trade-offs. So I'm hesitant to put rent control into place, because you're going to what it also did. Another thing about the study is it found that it lowered the property values of not only the rental building, but also the owned properties next to the rental properties. And there was what was it? The next thing, I'll pull it up here. Sorry, I'll just do it. Go to the right here. So it was Brookings Institute. What does economic evidence tell us about the effect of rent control? And let me just go back. Sorry. Folks, this is a podcast. It's not a radio show, so we can do things like this. But it was pretty good. It was author Palmer and Pathak, 2014. They studied Cambridge, Massachusetts, so right across the river from Boston. and they found that that once they did get rid of rent control, it boosted property values by $2 billion between 94 and 2004. Of the total effect, only $300 million is accounted for the direct effect of decontrol. They call it decontrol, getting rid of rent control and formerly rent controlled units. So while the residents who were while the residents who benefited from rent control undoubtedly benefited, but it was at the cost of, I think, the other residents and property owning people in the city. So I think we got to be careful about it. I think we got to look at all the other aspects that you're talking about. You know, it's a complex issue. So what other ideas or plans would you like to put forward to help address the housing situation?
Sure. Well, I think there are others. But before we jump into those, I do want to make sure that we're talking about things and in terms of the facts of the case. So, as you said, in this report, talking about it going in 1994. And we have to remember that the reason that rent control went away in 1994 wasn't specifically because Cambridge said, we don't want rent control. The reason was because it was a statewide referendum.
Right, statewide referendum.
Right, and it was a statewide referendum that was voted on about 51% to 49%.
Yeah.
There were only 3 communities out of all 351 in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Boston, Brookline, and Cambridge, that even had rent control.
Yeah.
And so it was largely a lot of other communities making a vote that took the ability for using this as a policy initiative and a policy intervention away from 3 communities that had been using it. So when I think that gets lost a lot of times in this conversation, both in terms of the conversation we have internally to communities, because people don't understand or have that history and that historical knowledge to understand that it wasn't just cities saying no, but also in those other communities saying, you know, and I've lived in other places, you know, went to college in other places, and you're getting back to, and it also goes to the core of what happens with home rule petitions a lot of times in the city of Boston, which is we're having other individuals voting on what we're doing in terms of our cities and our streets. And I think that shouldn't happen that way.
I slightly disagree. I mean, I do disagree on a little bit of that. Yes, you want your town to be governed by your town, but it's not like Boston is the capital of the state. It's the economic engine. It's the biggest employer. It's all of those things. So it's not like if you change something in Boston, it's just in a vacuum and doesn't affect the rest of the state or the surrounding communities. So, you know, if Boston were to change its laws, it will have effect on the commuters, the residents, the businesses, all of whom may not live directly in the city. But you bring up a good point. It was a state law that got rid of it. But I think by 94, or certainly in the mid-90s, we had learned a lot of economic lessons about rent control across the country. And if you look at New York City is actually a pretty good example of why, you know, unless I'm incorrect, I believe they still have rent control. And if you want to rent a normal studio apartment in Manhattan or anywhere, actually, it costs an insane amount of money, right? But that is because largely, well, I won't say largely driven, but is significantly driven by the concept that you can't get market rates for a huge number of units throughout New York City. So the ones you can get market rates it drives the market rate up tremendously. So, but if you're lucky enough to get into a rent controlled apartment, you're golden. So you do create this special carve out for folks, and for those folks, it's good, no doubt. But at what cost? So we can move on from rent control unless you have other points.
No, but I would say, you know, and I definitely see from other people's perspective why they have some reticence towards it. But I would say this: if you think about it just in historical, you know, A to B causality terms, we got rid of rent control in 1994. It's still incredibly expensive to live in the city of Boston, even without it, right? And one of the reasons for that is, you know, and I speak to this because it's important, I think, for people to understand. You know, it affects Boston, and as you said, Boston affects many areas around, and we'll get to that in a little bit. We're a company town, right? We are a company town. You know, we're an industry town. Now, in New York, it's finance. In Washington, it's politics. In LA, it's entertainment.
Right.
In Boston, it's academics, it's healthcare, and now emerging in the last probably 2 decades or so, it's biotech. Those are the 3 big pillars that undergird our economy. But one of the interesting things is 2 of those 3, and really, I think you could say the third with biotech, but definitely on the academic and the healthcare side, they're physically anchored industries. And by that I mean, unlike a car
Yeah.
plant or something,
Yeah.
you're not going to pick it up and move because you get a tax break and have Harvard go to Greenville, South Carolina, or someplace like that, right?
Right.
It's not gonna
They're
happen.
going to be, the hospitals and schools will
Always.
be
And
here.
since
yeah.
there's always going to be those, you're always going to have professors and deans and doctors and hospital administrators. And like any person, they're probably going to want to live close to their office so that they don't have to have a great commute. So you're constantly having a different kind of pressure and competition for many of our housing units here as well. And that has also downward pressure on everything in terms of keeping it. The average rent for a 1-bedroom apartment right now in the city of Boston is $2,200 for a 1-bedroom apartment. That's wild to think about, right? And there are communities across the country that are more expensive, but not a whole lot of them. And I think
we're in the top 5 or 10
Yeah.
for sure. Yeah.
And so I think, and when you couple that, right, when we're talking about families and trying to make, once again, a city where it's not just for the rich versus the poor, not just for singles, for saying, like I said, I have 2 young daughters, right? We also live in one of the cities that has and regions that has one of the highest costs of childcare as well. So when you couple that, it can be crippling.
So what other solutions, what other plans do you have in mind
Sure.
for housing?
So I think we need to increase the inclusionary development policy number, which right now stands at 13%. And that's city policy for those who don't know.
I'm not explaining what that policy is. I'm not familiar.
Sure. So in a nutshell, the inclusionary development policy is the percentage units of a particular development of 8 units or above that need to be deemed as affordable relative to federal standards correlated
Okay.
with AMI.
Okay.
So it currently sits at 13% set by the city. I've advocated, as have many in this race, for increasing it to 20%, which is more the industry standard across a lot of other major metropolitan areas. Now, there is an appetite, I know, out there for increasing it further than that. But I've said from the get-go that if we're going to do that, I think we can, but I think we have to do it in a responsible way. And by that, what I mean is bringing in housing rights activists, housing stability, neighborhood stability advocates, like groups like Right to the City, which has endorsed my candidacy, but also having at the other side of that table have developers. A lot of times I think on both sides, people tend to caricature and vilify. And I think one of the duties of your elected officials and your city government is to bring folks to the table and start from a place where we can work together, so that if we're increasing it to 25%, 30%, whatever we want, hopefully we can do it from a place where on both sides there's a little bit of give, a little bit of take, and that everybody walks from the table, 1, being aligned on what that number is, wherever we ultimately set it at, but 2, feeling bought into it and that they've been respected as part of the process and they've had a voice as part of that process.
As a staunch conservative Republican, I could actually agree that I think raising that percentage would add value to that. It's a 13 now.
13%, yeah.
The 35-40%. No, I mean, if you're saying 20, I think we can negotiate up to 20. I think that's a good idea, and if we can, as long as we keep building supply and keep building housing stock, that will create solutions for a lot of it. I mean, I know Governor Baker has been very good about getting, and actually I'll say Mayor Walsh too has done a decent job of trying to add to the stock of homes in the city, because you're right. I mean, the demand is so strong for all the reasons that you mentioned before for the industry around here, that is going to drive up the prices for both home buyers and renters. So if we can keep adding to that, and for home buyers that, when they qualify for affordable housing, I think those units should be made available. All
Absolutely.
right, so I might disagree with you on rent control, but at least I think there's one point we can. I think building more and having that proportion for affordable housing will probably do more good in the long run.
I think building is important. I think we have to be smart and intentional about what we're doing with that relative to zoning, streetscape design, that kind of thing, how we're siting things, density, those kind of conversations. I give Mayor Walsh a lot of credit. He was at the Greater Boston Chamber the other day, and he was talking and challenging some of the folks there to help him and help the city figure out ways to make it more affordable and make it more economically sensible to build middle class housing. We know that there's a lot of federal dollars out there for affordable housing, and there needs to be, because society should be judged by how it cares for its most vulnerable. And there's a lot of money to be made in high-end luxury developments, of course. But the development's going to come where the money is. So if they want to make some money, they have to
play by a certain amount of rules. Right.
And it's how we create those structures and supports to get towards middle-class housing. So once again, we can have a city where it's not just people living at the extremes, but it's across the spectrum. And I think that's very important. So I commend him for that, and I look forward to the opportunity to work with him on developing solutions towards that, after being sworn in, hopefully, in January. But I will say, I'm sorry.
No, I was going to ask you what other plans you might have.
Sure.
And I'm going to open a Coca-Cola here. So
that's a free commercial right there. Right, so
spray.
The other thing I think is that when we're having these conversations, as I said, talking about zoning, talking about changes there, I'm in support of Councilor Lydia Edwards and her proposal to make changes on the zoning board, the composition of the city zoning board of appeals. I would say I think that there should be an architect as well.
Is that different than what you were just suggesting, raising the percentage zoning? I mean, what specifically are you getting?
So the conversation around variances, for example, that individual projects, developers, things need, there's what's termed as of right. So there's the zoning code for the city.
We're going deep into it. All right, let's get it.
So there's the zoning code for the city, and if you're building something and it falls within the parameters of that zoning code, you can build it. It's considered as of right. Well, that's what they're calling.
Okay.
But if it exceeds those in any way, shape, or form, then you need a variance, and that needs to be approved by the zoning board. And that's a lot of what's caught up in that unfortunate scandal that's been taking place about bribery with the zoning board now. Councilor Lydia Edwards, who's the councilor for District 1, which is East Boston, where I used to live, Charlestown, and the North End primarily, has made a proposal to change the structure. The zoning board was set by statute, state statute, was actually designed around the 50s, and it has different participants that come from different areas. So the real estate community, for example, the building trades, that kind of thing. She's put forth a proposal that changes many of those individuals who would sit there, and I've been in support of that. But I would say one of the areas that isn't represented in a proposal that I think should be added is an architect. I think having an architect for a zoning board is actually critically important in terms of it's technical, right? You don't want somebody to get an approval because nobody realized that there's a center column in this building that needs for structural support. So I think things like that are very important. But I think even beyond what we're talking about, and those are the things that we're talking about at City Hall, that we're holding on to and making happen at City Hall. But there's another parallel conversation that has to happen here. And that conversation is the fact that the housing crisis, as you and others have deemed it, and I agree with, is not Boston specific. It is a regional housing crisis. And the only way that you're going to get to...
Oh, I'd agree with that. Yeah. I mean, demand is so high around Eastern Massachusetts.
And the only way that we're going to get to real workable, scalable solutions, honestly, is if we're having a regional approach to it. And I give the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, our local planning council for the greater Boston region, a lot of credit for trying to help them set the structure for some of these regional conversations. I think more can be done. I think it can be a more robust discussion. I think that Boston, as the largest community and as the one that's most impacted by the housing crisis, should really be stepping into a lead role on that in a much more vocal way. But we have to engage, communities like here in Arlington, right? We have to engage, Cambridge. We have to engage Brookline and Quincy. All of us around having a hand in making this happen, because it is, and it is something that is going to continue to affect us. And it's remembering that housing isn't just in its own vacuum; it affects transportation.
Well, I was at an event. Governor Baker spoke a few weeks ago where he talked about it, and actually something I hadn't thought about. The reason why our transportation issues are so well, I'll say traffic issues are so terrible. A huge component of that is that people are moving further and further out to afford something that they want to buy and can't take mass transit or closer to Boston, so they have to drive in. Thus, we get worse traffic. So it is a regional approach. And I think, I'll give great credit to Governor Baker, and he's been working with the legislature. Speaker DeLeo has been very good about trying to expand the housing stock across the country. So not to be, we went pretty deep on housing. Is there anything else you wanted to touch on for that?
No, only that, I will say this, only that I think as we're thinking about this too, it gives us the capacity to be really creative and thinking about this long term. right? Obviously, we are in an immediate crisis for many people. And as I said, there's those short-term interventions versus long-term interventions. But as we connect housing to transportation, I think about the fact that my wife is from Springfield, and we met in college in Western Mass in the Berkshires. And when you go out that way and head to Western Mass, it is wildly different in terms of everything, really, but particularly in terms of some of the pressures that are facing. And it's almost the inverse of Eastern Mass, which is they actually have land and housing stock. What they don't have are jobs. And you look and thinking long term about how we can connect it, because Massachusetts is many things, but it's not a huge state physically. And I know that Eric Lesser, who's the state senator out that way in Longmeadow, has actually been a strong proponent for a long time of trying to establish a high-speed east-west corridor from Springfield that would terminate in Boston and vice versa. And as somebody who's spent the better part of now 17 years going out and spending a lot of time out there, seeing the community, talking with folks out there, I think that actually has a lot of value, and would look forward to being a partner on this end of things in trying to work with, of course, our federal delegation as well, to figure out how we can set the stage to make something like that happen, because that could honestly revolutionize the state in many ways and really change the pattern, moving people, as you said, out into communities, but giving them, easy ways to get to and from work, changing what those pressures are on our housing market here. But we have to be visionary in thinking about that, but also intentional in making real plans to do that long term, because it's not something that's going to happen overnight.
So you're talking about what did you say, high speed? You said a commuter corridor, but it wasn't specific. You're talking about high-speed rail?
High-speed rail.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I had Jim Aloisi on a few months back, and he's a big proponent of rail. I am not, and I'll explain why. Because rail, it's a legacy technology that is tough to adapt. It's undynamic. Meaning, if things change, if we had a bus system or something like that, where you have dedicated road or dedicated tunnel, or who knows what it is, that's a lot less expensive to maintain, a lot less expensive to build, a lot less expensive to keep the vehicles going that do that. So I'm not the biggest fan of new rail. I think we have moved beyond that as a society, and we should keep up the rail that we have and make that efficient and fast. But new stuff, I'm very heshitant. I think robot buses are the way of the future, in my personal opinion. But just to touch on that, so I don't want to stay too long on housing issues, because I know there's a couple other important things going on in the city. So I asked for the top three. What is in your top three aside from housing?
So education. And how we're looking at that, obviously, the city's budget is about $3.3 billion. The education component of that for Boston Public Schools is the single largest area of that. And once again, I say this not just as a candidate, but I say this as a father and as a parent of a BPS student. My daughter just started in K1, which is, for those who don't know, is kind of pre-kindergarten.
Yeah, pre-K. Yep.
So about 6 weeks ago, and my wife and I remember very distinctly earlier this year, my wife calling me and telling me that we got not only into a K1 seat, which there's not enough K1 seats for every kid in the city right now. I know the mayor has a goal within the next, I believe, 5 years to finalize that promise, making sure that they're there, and I hope he gets there, and I hope they get there faster than that, to be perfectly honest, because there's a lot of kids who are going to miss out if we don't. But also the fact that we were at a level 1 school, and those seats are even fewer and further between, and it really felt in many ways like we got the golden ticket.
Explain to the audience what a level 1 school is in Boston. Sure. And me, I'm not as familiar with how the city's school board works. Yep.
And so for Boston Public Schools, they are basically graded out on performance from level 1 through level 4. So level 1 being a top performing school, and within the larger school system.
Is it a public school or
public school?
Charter school?
Public school.
Public school.
Yep.
Okay.
So traditional BPS public schools. And so as you go through the process, and as somebody who came from a different community, where you lived is where you went to school. That was just how it worked. Yep. Very linear. Boston, as a larger urban urban public school system isn't that. And so when we were enrolling our daughter in, we had a computerized algorithm that produced a list based on somewhat around geography, somewhat around the access to different levels of schools in the area. I tell the story all the time that we live on the west side of Dorchester now, near Franklin Park. And one of the schools that came up in our list was the Tynan School, which is a wonderful elementary school, and they have a wonderful school community, but it's in the middle of South Boston, which is on a good day, driving in rush hour morning traffic, probably a solid 20 to 25 minutes away.
Right. Yeah.
And thinking about that from just a quality of life standpoint in terms of driving our daughter there or putting her on a bus at 4 years old and sending her that far.
No, that would scare me to death.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's one of those things where, but if you think that that's your best option from the terms of the education of your child, you'll figure it out, right? You'll wake up a little bit earlier to drive there. You'll be very diligent about the bus, that kind of a thing. And families are facing those kind of concerns each and every day.
So we've been hearing about this, the education in inner city schools or city schools in general, and it can be cities, Boston, Lawrence, Springfield, all over the place, but densely populated cities have always had these educational issues, where the schools started to underperform and offer an inferior education to their kids. Now, I think Boston has gotten better, but it's still not great. Because, like you said, you were glad you got into a level 1 school. And I would imagine, correct me if I'm wrong, but probably a lot to do with that was that you are active parents in knowing which schools are better to get there, to hopefully kind of, is it just a lottery? Is it just luck of the draw that you got into a level 1 school, or did you try to apply to it, or how did that work out that you got there?
Sure. So you go through the process, you list and rank your schools in order of preference.
Well, there you go. Okay. So that's good. I mean, you're an involved parent, as I am, and you and your wife are, okay, here's our school list. These are the ones we want, and we got ranked into it. That in and of itself becomes a selection mechanism, right? Parents advocating for their children, because there's a lot of parents who are not advocating for their children or don't know that they should advocate for their children to do that. So the disparity of a level 1 to level 4, or if you were just ignorant of the system, how does that level 1 become everybody's level 1? Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
What's your plan for that? Because I think you might have a plan for education overall, but I'm going to kind of modify the questions that you brought up. Modify the situation, but because there are level 1 schools, there are level 4 schools. How do we make everything a level 1 school?
Sure. Well, the first is, I think we need to look and see and remember, every school is dealing with different things, right? I always say that I want my daughter to go to school and have the best educational and academic experience that she can, and personal experience and growth experience that she can. But in order for her to do that, she has to, one, be ready to learn, right, with whatever the structures and supports that we're providing at home. But also, the kids around her have to be ready to learn. And we know in an urban school system that kids are coming with a variety of different things. I'm, very excited about the fact that, and I give current counselor, Nisa Sahibi George, actually a lot of credit, and her work and advocacy to get nurses into every school, which I think is important and was a part of the most recent teachers union contract. I think that was a critical, positive step for our kids. But as we're talking about trauma-informed services, because we know that young people who are dealing with different levels of trauma for different reasons, and bringing that to school with them every day, making sure that every kid, it's one of the reasons we've expanded, not just locally but nationally, access to breakfast programs, to lunch programs, making them more universal, because we know kids need to eat and be fed. And for some kids, this is the only meal that they might get in a day, or the only 2 meals that they might get in a day. So having those kind of programs, but also being aware and culturally sensitive to, where I used to live in East Boston, it's got the highest percentage Latinx population in the city. So making sure that language facility, that people know there's somebody they can literally talk to in their school environment. I think that's critically important. And as we're looking at the schools, thinking about and examining what schools are performing. So the school that my daughter goes to, which I will refrain from naming on the air.
No, don't you don't have to do that.
But it's in Mattapan. It was a school that was in dire straits a few years ago, to be perfectly frank. And because it was in such dire straits, it actually triggered a provision within within the teachers union contract that changed the structure of governance of the school, made into a different kind of a model. And because of that, they've been able to turn it around. And now they're one of the best performing schools in their area.
I think the answer lies in something you just said. And, I mean, look, you're in politics now. I'm in politics. This is how it works. But the fact that something had to drop below a certain level of performance for that school in order for a union contract to trigger a mechanism that then began to put attention towards that school and then turn it around and fix it, I think that's terrible. I mean, that's the kind of, I mean, you know, you're in a lucky situation that, you know, that your daughter's only 4, you know, whenever the school turned around, it's brought it to this point in time and you're able to take advantage of it. And that's great. And so is, you know, hundreds of other families that are able to take advantage of that school. But why on earth, did it have to come to that? Do you know what I'm saying? Because year after year, those kids received an inferior education through the fault of what? Like, so the performance had to get so bad that the union, it triggered a mechanism, and then what? The union then changes what it does to help these kids out. It should, like, the mechanism should always be in place the way when I hear things like that. So that gets my ire up. You know, I get a little bit upset about that because I see that type of situation, and I'm glad it turned around. Don't get me wrong, but the idea that it has to hit a certain level of bad performance in order to turn around. I don't know about that. I mean, would you be in favor of something like that changes that whole structure, that we could get to a point where it flat out, if we see a decline in performance or a little bit, or even, you know, you said level 1, 2, 3, and 4. I mean, if somebody's slipping from 1 to 2, you know, that kicks it in. It shouldn't have to wait till it hits 4, right?
Well, I think one of the things we have to remember is, you know, it's not a widget factory, right? And every year we're dealing with different kids with different issues. And because of that, it'll have different impacts on performance and how we're setting those performance metrics. So it's that balance. It's finding that balance, respecting that, giving the time. You know, a 1-year dip might only be a 1-year dip, might come back up. Keeping an eye on it, of course. Taking positive things that are happening, taking good models, good methodologies, you know, in terms of school operations and pedagogy, and making sure that we can expand those out where we can. As best we can, but it goes back a lot of times to resources. I'm, you know, very happy about what the, you know, legislature is doing. I think there's always more we can do, but how they're talking about changing the foundation formula model with the bills that are currently going through and the efforts that are being put there is fantastic, and I think that's going to have a positive impact overall for BPS, and it's good. But it's also about oversight and making sure that we're using those dollars as effectively as we can. You know, I've advocated for a long time.
Do you think it needs more? I mean, do you think we need more money? If so, how much more? And then who? I mean, and if so, who pays for it? I mean, I was looking at the statistics. I'll pull it up. But you know, Boston's near the top of public schools. The only, as far as per pupil allocation of resources, the only ones that are really higher, the districts that are higher, are the vocational technical schools, for kind of obvious reasons, that they, you know, they need the infrastructure to educate.
Do what they do.
Yeah, do those vocational projects. But, you know, Boston's near the top at per pupil expenditure. You know, I guess always the answer we hear from city governments and city officials is, well, more money, more money, more money. And then 2 years later, it's like, yeah, well, we need more money. So, you know, this is one of those things where I think it can get, if we are, you know, we're both parents, we're both in politics, I think we can have a calm, rational discussion about this. Yeah. But when you bring it out to the public, it gets super emotional.
Of course it does.
Because there are, you know, parents are screaming like, yes, you said more money 3 years ago and nothing changed, or it got worse, or whatever the situation is. So, I can agree with you that, you know, maybe external factors might have even impacted the school your daughter goes to, from going from level 4 to level 1 and being a high performer. Who knows? Maybe the neighborhood changed. Maybe people moved. Maybe, you know, who knows? A whole number of factors could have taken place. But what is there something specific we can get into for the education of those city kids?
Yeah,
because this is one thing where I think it's disparate. In Massachusetts, we're always ranked at the top, right? For the states for education, we're always ranked first or second. Yeah. So I wouldn't say there's much we need to change. We can always improve and fine tune as a state. But what's going on in the city that you think maybe one or two things specifically that you as a Boston City Councilor can do, that you can pass a law, make something happen, make that positive impact to really affect that change?
Sure. Well, I think a lot of it, first off, is understanding that as a city councilor, you're working in conjunction with the mayor. It is a strong mayor system. And a lot of times for these things, because they do end up as home rule petitions, they have to go up to the legislature. So we have to have a good working relationship with our legislative delegation and through them with the other members.
Let's assume everybody's on board.
Okay. That's a great assumption. I like that. That makes life a lot easier.
I'm a dreamer. What are you gonna...
No, I think first it's being honest, right? So to the point about per pupil spending, there is a high level per pupil spending in Boston public schools, and it is higher than almost any other district around the state. But you also have to remember that there is a significantly different level of need in a lot of our students in terms of the services that they're receiving that other communities simply don't have because of other supports and other things that are going on in those communities, right? So there are neighborhoods, where, and I'm not talking about just the wealthiest communities, but where kids aren't worried in the same way about violence on the street.
You know what? I'm sympathetic to that, right? Because the school can only do what the school can do. Right. That is a very valid point. And when we talk about education in the inner cities, as that is an issue. Violence and all. But
I'll say this too. The other thing, and it's an interesting dynamic that we're seeing now, which is now we're seeing an interesting influx where we have parents that have typically, historically, traditionally left the city, who are staying. And not just staying, but raising families, and not just staying and raising those families, but enrolling and investing their children in Boston public schools. And so one of the other things that we have to be cognizant of and mindful of from a city council standpoint and oversight standpoint in the questions that we're asking is the fact that we don't want to see a stratified system, even more so within and under the umbrella of Boston public schools.
So how do you think we prevent that?
Well, one thing, so a lot of us filled out a questionnaire from the Boston Coalition for Educational Equity, and one of the questions on it was relative to private fundraising initiatives for public schools. They cited Boston Latin School, which is always kind of held up as the example, and that they have
alumni. Like virtually every high school with a name brand, whether it's private or public, does those types of things from their alumni. Yeah. And
Boston Latin was able to their credit, raise about $53 million in a capital campaign, which is, kudos to them. It's hard work raising money, as you know and I know. It's hard work raising money.
Yep.
But that money was kept and is kept really localized on campus to the support of those students, and that's great. What I've said and what I've put forward is that there is a model that I've seen other places where I think that we should cap the amount that is raised and kept specifically on a campus. That we should have a conversation about how we determine what that cap should be, and that monies raised beyond that cap should be split, with 50% of it staying on the campus and 50% of it going towards the Boston Educational Development Fund. Well,
keep going. Yep.
Which is the repository for that, where schools that are in greater need because of various factors can go and petition for grants that they need. But also, I've also said that as part of that grant making process, those schools should have access to grants that provide technical assistance to help them develop their fundraising capacities and be more robust, so that it's not just that they're always having to come hat in hand and let other schools raise money for them, because I do understand people's reticence towards that, but that we're giving them the skills-based things that we need in sports that those schools need, so they can develop their own fundraising strategy, so that it's not just about the dollars and cents of it, but it's also about the sense of community and school pride as well. A community, and that's what a school really is, right? It's a community that can and has the ability, maybe with a little help at the beginning, to do more for itself, is one that's going to feel more empowered, and that's what we want.
It's a weird situation, right? Because I'm hesitant to have the government get involved in private fundraising efforts that take place to help a specific school or specific cause, and then they start putting limits on that. But again, it's private fundraising for a public institution, which just seems, I guess I've never, it makes your mind melt if you want to get into it that much, but. Aside from the fundraising, do you see something? So I guess what I'm getting at is that
what can we do?
Yeah, what can you do? Because the money, if somebody were, I think I think virtually most people, and I say the vast majority, 80-90% of people, when you tell them, you know what, folks, we need X amount of dollars and this will definitely fix it, they go, okay, maybe, but I think so, because it's for schools, and schools help property values, and obviously it's for the kids' education. But we've been hearing about the money situation for so long. So I'm a big advocate, as was Governor Baker, for the charter school initiative, raising the cap for charter schools, because at some point the performance of these schools has to be held accountable, and you can give parents options if they're allowed to have those options. And right now we're not allowed to have those options. So I will say this, Boston City Council is limited in this. This is more of a state legislature thing for the charter aspect of it. I mean, but you don't have to get into specifics with the plan or the vote, because you wouldn't necessarily be voting on it. But would you support that? Would you support raising the cap, if not lifting it? That at some point, what can you do year after year? These kids are missing out, and every year they get a little bit more behind. Let's affect real change. Let's try to get something going that we can have an immediate impact on, changing the school structure itself.
Yeah.
Is that something you're open to, or what do you think?
Yeah. So, and obviously this is a long-standing conversation, particularly within, city, educational conversations, city political conversations. I've been on record. I voted against the lifting and raising of the charter cap. And one of the big reasons for me was around the fact that the funding model has to get settled first before we're adding more schools into the system. Right now, it's about 87.5 cents of every dollar that comes in from state aid to the city of Boston that goes redirected right back out towards our charter schools and within the BPS system, and then the rest going towards more traditional schools. I think until we can get the funding settled so that people have access to it and there's more equity there, then if people want to have a conversation about it, I'm always open to a conversation. I'm not going to just tell people flat out, no, never, it's never going to happen. But I think we have to get to that place first, making sure those dollars, I think, are being spent in a more equitable way, and then we can get there. But I think go ahead. But I think we also, a lot of times we get, lost a little bit in the weeds on the conversation around the dollars and cents, and not thinking enough about the operations piece. And that's why one of the things that I
think that's the crux of it, right? Yeah. I mean, the charter school in and of itself, these schools are only located, less than a mile apart from each other, and in relatively the same neighborhoods, or in fact the same neighborhoods, yet the performance of them is completely, on the opposite ends of the spectrum. So the operations of them in charter schools compared to some of the public schools is better. They're getting the job done for whatever reasons that I'm not a professional in, so I can't necessarily nail it down. Would you be in favor of at least saying, if a model of a charter school works, applying that model to a public school, even if that means changing, getting rid of the teachers who aren't, performing up to snuff, and maybe ruffling a few feathers that can impact the change in a more immediate sense? I'm talking soon. Like, you're going to hit the ground running, right? You get elected there. I don't think there's any time to waste. And as we in the political realm know that people that in our business love to waste time if they can, if they don't want to do something. But and I'm not saying that's to you specifically, but what I am saying, I think this is an urgent thing. I think this is the kind of thing you can affect immediate change. Buildings and housing takes years. Right? You got to plan it out. You got to actually build it. It can take
We just moved into a new build house. Trust me. I know.
Yeah, exactly. So that takes a long time. You're looking at a long time horizon. You can affect immediate change in the course of a summer by improving work practices at the schools, staffing changes of underperforming teachers, problem teachers, getting in new, enthusiastic, hungry teachers, more involvement with the parents. A lot of the programs you mentioned before, having nurses on staff, people going out and calling parents of kids who might be in need, getting them involved, doing all that hard work, that nitty-gritty stuff that needs to get done. But somebody's got to lead the charge on it. Somebody's got to actually open up the space and relax the rules to make that happen. I don't personally care if a charter school or a public school educates that kid. I care that the kid gets a great education and has a safe learning environment, and a good learning environment, a prosperous one. We're not there, It's so. Any of the above, all the above. I mean, what can we get to that what's something tangible we can get to? Yeah.
So I think that one of the original promises and proposals that was made in terms of the larger charter school movement was just that these would be these innovative educational laboratories where we would try new things, work outside of the bounds, and then be able to take those models and apply them in a more traditional public school setting.
Right.
And I think that unfortunately, largely that for various reasons hasn't been lived up to that promise. And I think that's been one of the issues that folks I know who are more active in the educational space on an academic level have expressed to me.
Do you think that's because of the models themselves, or they were applied poorly?
I think it's very much school by school. So I think in some schools it is the model. I think in some schools it's just management and operations. There's any one of a host of things. Every school's its own individual snowflake, if you will. But I think that where we have seen some success is, in the pilot school movement within BPS, right? That there are schools that are taking that kind of approach, and I think there's a way to do that. And I think the pilot schools, present us with an option where we can both be innovative and dynamic in terms of the models and the ways in which we're approaching education for our kids, but also respecting the fact that there are individuals and the adults and the teachers and the administrators and folks who work there who do have a labor environment that they're operational in, and that they have and should have access to fair and equitable wages, that they should have fair labor practices, things like that. I think it's how we find that balance. It's tough. It's tough work, right? But and if we aren't engaged in thinking about that and trying to figure out how we can expand those options, this isn't the business to be in. But I will say, to the larger scope of management and oversight, that's one of the reasons that I think it's so important that we make some fundamental changes to the school committee in Boston. Right, we're the only school district.
Yeah, get into that for a second, because I mean, I didn't follow it as closely. There used to be an elected school committee. There was. And then it was
up until 1991. There was an elected school committee.
It was now appointed.
Yes, and
by
once again,
whom?
So it was changed. It was changed by the legislature, and so
the state legislature.
The state legislature. Yeah, okay. Yeah. It's on the books. You can go look it up in Mass General Laws right now. And it was changed and made into a fully appointed school committee, with the appointments coming from the mayor. And the members that are appointed come through another committee, which is the school committee nominating committee, made up, once again, dictated by the legislature in terms of the representation of that group. And at the time, part of it goes back to the history of, and in some ways, the legacy of busing, and that there were a lot of contentious, voices that were at work and vocal on the school committee, and that a lot of folks felt that the decisions that were being made by the school committee, the elected, formerly fully elected school committee, weren't being made in the best interest of children and their education. They were being made for more political reasons, unfortunately, and very explicit political reasons that way. And so
yeah, I could see that.
It moved that way. Yeah. What I've said is, now that we're close to 2 generations beyond that, we can reapproach this. But I do respect the fact that there are people who live in the city, people who had children who went through that process, and now they have grandchildren system who do have a reticence, because they remember, kind of, as they put it, the bad old days, as they've told me, and not wanting to return to that. And what I've proposed since the beginning of this race is a hybrid school committee model, where you have a 7-member board. You have 4 members that are appointed. You have 3 members that are elected. And of the 4 members that are appointed, 2 are under the auspices of the office of the mayor, 1 just being kind of an at-large member, 1 being a student member selected through the student selection process that currently exists, and that student having full voting powers. And a lot of folks have questions about that.
Time out. Yeah, I have questions about that. Say that one more time.
that you would have a student member, they would sit on the board, and that they would have voting power. And the reason I go back to that is because
you're going to have to really justify that one to me,
because I was that student.
All right.
See, at the state's Board of Higher Education, they also have a student member that sits on that board, and I served as the voting student member on that board. And I know the value of having that student voice there as the ultimate inline consumer of these services, and having that input there. I think that's critically important, having that voice there. So I would have those 2. I'd have 2 other members.
Financial matters? You had to vote on finances, or what was the scope of the?
I voted on everything.
Really?
Yeah, full voting. Yeah.
Is that still going on today?
Yeah, and actually, one of the projects that I worked on in the year that I served as a student member, because it rotates between, to get a little bit aside from city politics, it rotates between what is now the state university system, the community college system, and the UMass system on a 3-year rotational schedule. Then I realized, as coming from then state college.
Oh wait, all right, time out. I'm a little bit confused. I thought it was the student member was like a high school student or something like that. Or is it? Or
It is.
But okay, but high school and college.
So
Both?
when I served, I was in college serving on the State Board of Higher Education.
Oh, okay.
This would be for the Boston School Committee.
Oh, all right. I see what you're saying. Got it.
Sometimes I talk a little too fast.
No. That was just for clarification's sake on my end.
No, it's okay. But once again, I think that having that student voice there is really important. And then I would add 2 members appointed by the city council. Currently, the city council doesn't really have a voice on the school committee. The city council doesn't contribute to that list of appointed members. The city council doesn't have to vote on approving the members that are selected.
That's something I could get behind that.
Yeah.
Because I think if it's appointed by the mayor, the whole school committee, I mean that opens up a different can of worms. But I think the elected legislature of the city should certainly have a voice in who gets appointed to the committee. I think it's about that committee.
Exactly. And I think it's about the voice, but I think it's more about accountability. Right. If you were to ask, any city councilor could give you an answer and say, look, we don't make the decisions on the school committee. We can go, we can testify, we can advocate, but we don't have a direct voice there, and they're not wrong. Right. And so I think that as you said, the elected legislative body of the city government, they should have a little more skin in the game that way. So what I've proposed is having one member that's appointed directly by the city council president, representative of the body, and the other member being either the education chair themselves or their designee.
This just dawned on me, and it probably has dawned on several people who have kids in Boston, is basically the mayor controls the schools.
Yeah, in many ways.
Because the work changes for teachers' unions go through the school committee, right? Then that negotiation, the school committee itself is appointed by the mayor, not accountable to the elected legislature. Ergo, you have the mayor as a de facto boss of the schools, which I guess they are and they are not anyway, but now it's pretty much direct. Okay. I always say the one thing, for city government, there's 3 basic things that for city government, I think, whether you're on the council or you're a mayor, is you have to keep the streets safe. You have to keep the kids learning, and essentially keep the potholes filled and running, like the basic infrastructure of the city, because it's a lot less complex than, say, a state government or national government. But those are some pretty good ideas, I think, for how we can affect change. I do like the idea of the school committee being selected more, or having the city council having more of an input in that.
I think it's critical. And then the other piece of that is those 3 elected positions. Okay. And so I would take, there's 9 city council districts, and so just combine them. So 1 through 3, 4 through 6, 7 through 9. Okay. I think it's important. And one of the reasons that I put the model together in that way is because, as you can go through the checklist there of who's on the committee, nobody has a majority off the bat. Right, the mayor has his contingent, the city council has their contingent, the elected members form their contingent, but no one has a majority.
I think that's a good opportunity for balanced change. Sure.
Exactly, yeah. And it incentivizes people to hopefully be mature and adult in making those decisions and work for a little bit of compromise and understanding, which I think is important. But I think when we're talking about education too, we have to think a little bit more broadly and boldly about what we're doing. So one of the other proposals that I've put out, and actually every week for your listeners here and those who are viewing, if they sign up on my website, davidhalbert.com, every week for the 7 weeks prior to the preliminary, and then starting up again today, actually, with an email. I've been sending out policy emails that I write myself personally, getting into issues. And this week's email was focused on an idea I have around a high school level municipal co-op program. And by that, what I mean is I went to Northeastern for grad school. The co-op program, for many folks who are familiar with Northeastern, is an opportunity for students to really get their hands involved kind of deeply into whatever area they're going into potentially professionally. And it's good. It's a great program. I had a lot of friends who went through and had a lot of success because of it. Okay. For years, as a staffer, as somebody who's lived in the city, I've heard talk about city government, particularly about certain areas where there's lack of diversity in city government, and that these agencies don't look like the city that they serve. But as we know, there's a lot of talk in government. We need more action. Right. And so what I've proposed is making a program similar to that co-op program, where we're taking our city agencies and partnering them directly with our high schools and saying whether it's inspectional services in English high school or Boston Water and Sewer in the Burke, whatever it is, students can come in, they can start as freshmen, they can opt into a program, and they can spend their time learning about that agency so that when they graduate, in addition to getting the diploma, they also have the skill set ready to walk in and hit the ground running on day one.
They have work experience.
Exactly, and I think that's critical because not only does it provide them with an opportunity for jobs here in Boston as the next generation of our municipal workforce, but also gives them skills that they can take to other communities in the surrounding area and say, I know how to do this. I've worked around these projects, these different people who are involved in connecting. So it's creating that own network. I think it's really important.
All right. We've gotten a 2 out of the 3. Housing and education. And I know you're running, you have something you have to get to after we're done speaking. Believe me, that this is we're going about an hour. So it's flown by pretty quick. Is there a third issue you want to talk about?
Sure.
Maybe if we probably won't give it justice to discuss it in maybe 5 minutes or so. But what did we ask for the top 3? What's number 3?
Sure. So I think the third is really around economic development and really making a way for more economic development in targeted and under-resourced and underserved communities. And so
that's been one that's been floating around for a long time, and we get into I've had some other guests on the podcast to talk about that. So what are you thinking about doing?
I think, once again, let's be creative with it. And so there's a thing in Boston that comes up a lot, which is called PILOT. And for those who don't know, PILOT is an acronym. It stands for Payment in Lieu of Taxes. And what it is the assessment that we provide and ask for major nonprofit institutions, which comprise a significant portion of real estate and other holdings in Boston, ones that are valued at about $15 million and above.
Oh, okay. So because they're not profit, they don't get the same tax.
They don't get taxed at all.
Yeah,
You can't. So we ask, it's primarily applied to colleges and universities, hospitals, and major cultural institutions. So the MFA, William Aquarium, those kind of things.
Okay, so economic development, you want them to pay more?
Hold on. Let me explain.
Sure, get to it. We got it.
So right now, those holdings are valued based on 2012 real estate levels. So first thing is, I think we need to increase that, and the Pilot Action Task Force has called for this as well, and I'm in support of this, making sure that those assessments are reflective of the year that we're actually in. I pay taxes on my home at 2019 levels. If we're setting what that baseline looks like, it should be on current levels.
I'm going to agree with you.
There we go.
I'm going to agree with you. I think if the structure has been set up to that, they are nonprofits, but payment in lieu of taxes, because they do take up resources, and whatever the agreement is that's worked out, they should be up to current date.
Exactly.
Definitely.
What we ask in Pilot is that these institutions basically make total contributions to the city and about to the effect of a quarter of what they would pay if they were paying full market rate taxes on these properties and holdings. And what that breaks down to is 50% cash, just actual checks written to the city, and 50% in community benefits. Now, a lot of times...
Is that the current structure? Or okay,
that's the current structure. So about 12.5% of what they would pay being paid in cash. A lot of times where the conversation gets bogged down is on that cash side, understandably, because institutions are typically more apt to provide the community benefits side to its full amount or something close to the full amount than they are on the cash side.
I hear you. Yep.
So part of it is
they game it a little bit, right?
And part of it is making sure that we're making that ask and making that assertively but responsibly as well, and working with them and trying to once again get those numbers up. And a lot of times the conversation it gets bogged down in that kind of head-to-head. But, and this is the area where I think I'm a little bit different than others in talking about Pilot, because a lot of folks talk about forcing schools to provide more.
Yeah, I mean, the progressive bent of a lot of the potential city councilors and current city councilors is just more money, and without realizing what the trade-offs would be because of that. It's negative trade-offs for a lot of this stuff. But so. Okay, say you tighten up the structure around Pilot. You get folks to kind of like, hey, folks, we agreed to 50% cash. I know, let's stop playing fast and loose. Okay, we tighten that up. But what does that money go to? What are we talking about, how that affects actual economic development throughout the city? I'm assuming you mean economic development in neighborhoods that lack economic development.
Largely. But actually, and it's funny you should say that. So the final piece of this puzzle for me, as I presented it, is yes, having more dollars coming from that side is absolutely a goal. We should be pushing for that, as we can. I do agree with that. But I think where we lose the thread and we don't take enough advantage and opportunity is on the community benefit side, actually. Because we have, particularly in the college and universities, we give them very wide latitude in the definition of what constitutes those community benefits and how they're benefiting the community. And I think we as the community should be a little more intentional about that. What I've proposed since the beginning is targeted incentivized procurement. These are all large institutions that need a lot of things, right?
Let's get into that with layman's terms. What's
sure.
Targeted
incentivized procurement? Sure.
Procurement.
Basically, it's this. Northeastern, BC, the MFA, all these things, they need paint. They need nails. They need ladders and light bulbs. All these things that they tend to buy in bulk from large institutional vendors.
Are you getting at Boston first?
Very much so. Very much so.
Okay,
I'm always putting Boston first.
You're starting to sound like a certain president that I don't want to, I'm sure you don't want to sound like.
But by that, I mean this. What I've said is let's ask these institutions to purchase those goods and services where they can from our small local businesses. And the way that we do that, though,
is that would count towards their community benefit pilot.
And in addition,
allocation.
Exactly. So a dollar for dollar match towards what we're asking for their pilot. But we'd also give them a percentage to make it economically feasible and, entice them a little bit.
David Halbert, I don't know what this is. You're a progressive Democrat. I'm a conservative Republican. I'm actually agreeing with some of the ideas you're coming out with. That's a pretty good idea.
Yeah. I think we can, and I think it's using market forces to drive it, right? So we give them that percentage if they're patronizing any small business. Yeah. But if you're going to patronize a small business that's minority owned, that's women owned, that's veteran owned, however we want to define those other categories, we increase what that percentage is. So we drive it and make more sense for you to spend some of those dollars there. It's good. And when I talk to people, particularly colleges and universities about it, it's a light bulb moment because they say, of course, we have to buy these things anyway. So why not support those businesses in our backyard? Now, I'm on the board for East Boston Main Streets, which is part of the larger Main Streets network in Boston, supporting small businesses in our community. So small business development is really important to me. But one of the reasons that it's so important to me speaks to not just my service on the board, but what I did before becoming a full-time candidate. I worked at the Middlesex Sheriff's Office, and there were...
Oh, yeah. I knew when our paths crossed when you were working for Sheriff Tompkins.
Exactly.
I forgot what
Katusian. Tompkins is my backyard.
Oh, yeah. Well, Katusian's here. Yeah. Peter and I are friends, but yeah.
Good guy. So... I heard so many stories of individuals talking about the struggles they felt that they were going to face upon reentry, and that they didn't want to come back behind bars. But they felt that when they got out, there were so many things stacked against them that ultimately they would end up engaging in, different activities out on the streets that would land them back in being incarcerated. And one of those is, we know if we can get people access to jobs, just good, decent, hardworking jobs, that has such a disproportionate impact on getting them and keeping them on the straight and narrow path. So a lot of times for a lot of these larger, corporate entities, they have their own internal, strictures and rules, and they're not going to employ.
That's a tougher sell.
It is, but it's those small local businesses, right, that provide that option because your owner coached you in Little League or grew up, down the street from your grandparents and saw you as a kid or was in church with you. And I'll give you an example. I was just talking with someone yesterday, and they were talking about Norfolk Hardware, which is located in Dorchester, on the Dorchester-Mattapan line. Okay. Right? Been in business for 85 years. I just bought a ladder from there the other day, right? Great shop, great community-based organization, a family that's been involved in the community for a long time. The gentleman I spoke to yesterday was talking about how he knew of a young man who had come out of incarceration, had been involved, had been shot in a drug deal gone bad, the kind of person that a lot of people would write off, unfortunately. Right. And this young man came out and he just wanted an opportunity. Norfolk Hardware brought him in and said, okay, we're going to give you this chance. We brought him onto the staff. He started working. He's been a phenomenal employee. Now they're moving him on. They're getting him on their installation crew, going in, putting in cabinetry for people, developing skills. This guy, more than likely, statistically speaking, is not going to go back. He's made a positive change in his life. He's proud of that, and he's been able to do that because the people in Norfolk Hardware cared enough about people in our community to provide that kind of an opportunity.
So you're talking about working with the sheriff's office to do what pilot in the different, not an acronym sense of the word, but pilot a program for people re-entering. Or I think it's exiting jail to get hired. So what are you proposing exactly along those ends?
Sure. I think, well, one, working with our Office of Small Business in the city of Boston, providing them with more resources as well, so we can work to help ease that transition where we need and foster those connections between organizations like our local sheriff's offices, because people stay in there in such small periods of time and going back in. But I think this goes back in a larger sense to why we need to support small businesses in as many ways and as many creative ways as we can, because it's by supporting small businesses like Norfolk Hardware or Wallpaper City in Rosendale or the True Value over on Charles Street in Beacon Hill. It's those businesses that can be transformative for people's lives in a very different way. And we also know from an economic dollars and cents, it's better for our communities. When you spend $1 at a small local business, on average, 68 cents of that dollar goes back into your neighborhood. You know, they're paying for t-shirts for your Little League teams. They're sponsoring benches that, you know, our senior citizens are sitting on. They're taking care of their community in a different kind of a way. And so because we're providing that, and because those small businesses, that's what really provides the character of our neighborhoods, right? Look, I'm not going to lie. I go to McDonald's, you know, like everybody else just about in America, right? But at the same time, when I leave here, one of the things I'm doing is heading out and I'm meeting somebody for dinner, and we're probably not going to McDonald's. We're going to go to a small local, Italian restaurant, local place. It's literally that local flavor that, you know, these different small businesses bring to our communities. And that's what helps make Boston such an amazing, vibrant, dynamic city. So we have to do more, in my opinion, to do everything that we can to support those, and to make sure that in those areas that have unfortunately seen either lack of investment or disinvestment over time, we're doing everything we can to support those and try to make that economic growth more robust so that everybody has a chance to buy in. Because it ties back to what we were talking about at the beginning. When we're providing those economic incentives, when we're providing those economic opportunities, that's what provides the capital that helps drive communities, that provides the money that's paying for rent, and more importantly, provides the money that people can go from renters, hopefully, to home ownership, which we know is so critical, not only in stabilizing communities, but in providing intergenerational wealth opportunities. It's all of a piece.
All right. Well, David Halbert with a B, because I want to make sure people go to davidhalbert.com.
Yes, HALB is in Boston, ERT.
All right, go to davidhalbert.com for more information about David's campaign. The election is Tuesday, November what?
Tuesday, November 5th, and you're going to find out information not just on our website, but if you follow me on social media. Thankfully, we were able to get everything as @VoteHalbert, so whether it's Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, please, I'd love for your listeners to chime in what their thoughts were from our conversation today.
Your handle is on the graphics here at Vote Halbert. I don't think there are any Republicans running for at-large, so I could say...
I believe Councilor Garrison is a registered Republican.
Okay, well then technically I have to say go vote for Councilor Garrison. I think that's Althea Garrison, and I have no knowledge of her campaign really. But you can also vote for David, who I think has demonstrated a full reasonable policy knowledge, making a lot of sense. Maybe not so much on rent control, but we'll have to agree to disagree. But yes, check out votehalbert.com. As for us, if you are watching this on Twitter, that's great. But don't forget to subscribe to us on YouTube. Subscribe to us on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, all of your podcatchers. And that's it. Might have another special guest on Sunday, so tune back into me and or forward this to your friends, share it. David, man, thank you so much for coming on my podcast. I appreciate it. Hopefully people got a lot out of this discussion. I always try to raise the level of depth that we get into on the specific issues. But I appreciate running, man. I know it takes a lot. It's very there's a lot of sacrifices to family and personal life, but you're doing it for a good cause, a good thing to get into. And I, since we've known each other for about 7 years now, I know you're a good guy, and the Boston City Council would be well served by having you. All right, that's it for me. That is the Lincoln Review podcast. Have a great night, and David, thanks again.
Thank you for having me.
Bye-bye.